There are some times in your adventure when you want to do things that are just monumental. There are situations that come up, there are things that need to take place, there are things that need to happen, and it's not something that can be done just by a simple spell that takes two actions. It might require an hour, it might require a day, it might require multiple days in order to make these things happen. And rituals are these things that allow you to do really, really big things. And you know what? You don't even need to be a caster in order to use these things. My name is Don. I'm trying to be the Sly Strategist, and let's go ahead and get into it. A ritual is a complex, esoteric, super large scale spell that requires a lot of times not only a caster, but requires secondary casters in order to assist what is going on with the ritual. If you are taking charge of the ritual, then you are considered the primary caster, even if you are not a caster in your class. You could have a one class party of barbarians, but you know what? They can pull off a ritual if they have the associated skills in order to perform it. Now, there are requirements for performing rituals. First of all, you must know the ritual, and the ritual spell level can be no higher than half your level rounded up. So, for example, if you wanted to cast a fifth level ritual, then you would need to either be level 9 or level 10. Half of level 9 is 4.5, rounded up is going to be 5. You also must have the required proficiency rank in the skill used for the ritual's primary check and only the primary check. For example, we'll use Commune with Nature. For Commune with Nature, you must, as the primary caster, be at least master level in nature in order to even begin to perform this ritual. Now, the secondary casters don't necessarily have to be a specific proficiency level, but it does tell you what their checks are going to be. And for Commune with Nature, it's going to be nature, surprisingly enough. Now, with you as the primary caster, you are the one who must attempt this skill check to determine the ritual's effects. And the primary skill check is the one that determines the tradition. So, for example, on a nature ritual, the tradition is going to be primal. On a religion primary skill check, it is going to be divine. So, it will basically adhere to the magical tradition. Now, rituals don't require spell slots to cast, as we previously mentioned, and you can heighten a ritual if it's available up to half your level rounded up, just as it was before. And this is decided when the ritual is initiated. So you can't roll a good check and then decide, oh, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and heighten it. It needs to be decided when you initiate the ritual. Now, a ritual will always take at least 1 hour to perform, and most take a day or multiple days in order to happen. It is generally a downtime activity, but you can do it in exploration mode. It's just a little bit risky because if you are interrupted in any way, you've pretty much wasted the amount of time that you've already spent in order to perform the ritual, and you will need to begin again. Now, when we say a day of casting, we're generally speaking about an 8-hour level of participation in that particular ritual. Now, there are breaks during multi-day rituals that do allow for rest. So if it is a 3-day ritual, you won't be chanting for 72 hours. You're going to be doing 3 days of 8 hours. Now, one caster can continue a multi-day ritual, usually just with some light chanting and meditation in order to keep it going while the other casters rest. All rituals are going to require material, somatic, and verbal components throughout the entire casting time. And in addition to those particular components, there is usually a cost associated with it, and that will be listed in the stat block, and we'll go over that in a little bit. Now that we kind of have this overview going, let's go ahead and get into our next segment. Now let's go ahead and cover just the general stat block to make it a little bit easier to understand. At the beginning of your stat block, you are going to have a cast time, how long it will take, and we'll use a 1-day cast. In a 1-day cast, basically you're going to be 8 hours. So 8 hours of continuous casting in order to pull it off. Now there sometimes will be a cost associated with it. Costs are paid and all resources that are needed in this particular cost part of the stat block at the end of the ritual. It isn't something that you would pay for at the beginning of the ritual, and then if you were interrupted, then you would lose it. You do not pay them until the end of the ritual, just prior to the primary check being rolled. And secondary casters are basically a number of helpers who assist the primary caster. And when you are actually performing the ritual itself and you get to the end, the secondary casters, even though it says secondary, but the secondary casters will roll first. And what the secondary casters will do is the secondary casters will basically adjust your success. We'll kind of get into that a little bit, but critical successes give you a +2, failures give you a -4, and critical failures not only give you the -4, but if you, as the primary caster, were to get a critical success, you actually only got a success. And if you got a success, then you are going to get a failure instead, if your secondary caster does a critical failure. Once again, we'll kind of get all into that more towards an actual example when we're doing it. But let's talk just a little bit more about the secondary casters. Now, a secondary casters, once again, are there to support you or support the primary caster. And the secondary casters do not need to know the ritual, nor do they have to be a specific level of proficiency in what their particular check is. But that is what they will be rolling against. If there are multiples listed, for example, we'll use Primal Call, which has crafting, diplomacy, and survival, but there are 4 casters. Well, there will only be 3 rolls being done. The 4th caster is not like a backup. The 4th caster just won't cast anything. So any successes, critical successes, failures, or critical failures will only be rolled once. And once again, these secondary casters are there to assist the primary caster. Each secondary caster may only attempt 1 roll. And I do want to state this simply because since this is a downtime or exploration activity, fortune and misfortune effects do not affect this. So if you have something like Halfling Luck or you have something like True Strike, you cannot use this in your secondary check. Now let's kind of go back to the primary caster. In any particular ritual that you do, and I will go ahead and kind of highlight a couple up here, but in any particular, actually it's probably going to be over here, any particular ritual you're trying to do will have a primary check, and it will state what level or what proficiency level the primary caster needs to be to even attempt it. You will not see that on secondary checks because secondary checks do not require a specific proficiency level, although higher proficiency levels will obviously adjust your roll usually better the higher your proficiency level is, but it is required for the primary caster. It could be a master, it could be expert, but usually they will need to have some level of skill in order to begin the ritual. Now, there are various other things that can be in the stat block, such as a range, depending on what type of ritual it is. It can be targets if the ritual requires a target. It can be a duration that can be variable depending on what exactly you're trying to do. But always pay attention to your stat block for your ritual so you kind of know what you're getting into, what it can do, and what the requirements are. Now, with kind of all that being done, let's go ahead and get into how you can learn a ritual, or if you can't learn the ritual, how you can access them. Now, as stated before, learning a ritual does not count against your spell slots, or if you are not a caster, it is still something that you can learn. However, rituals are never common, though if you, generally speaking, look hard and talk to your GM and tell them what you want to do, you can probably find someone who can perform an uncommon ritual for you, or they might be able to teach you the ritual, or you might be able to find the ritual in a library, in a book, in a scroll, although that is not guaranteed. And even if you find someone that can perform the ritual, they may not be willing to teach it to you. So you might just have to do whatever they want you to do in order to do the ritual for you. High-level rituals might require you to go to higher-level settlements. Once again, these particular rituals, especially high-level ones, might require a certain level of settlement in order to perform, so you might be traveling in order to get a ritual done. Now, as stated when we were going over the stat block, the cost lists the valuable components that are required to cast the ritual. If the ritual does not have any such components, then it will not have a cost entry. A good example of this is Control Weather, which does not have a cost. Costs are often a base cost multiplied by the target's level and sometimes the spell's level that they're trying to do. And if the target's level is lower than 1, then you're just going to substitute a 1 in there instead. You can't kind of cheat that way and multiply by 0 and get 0. Now, when you do heighten a ritual, if the ritual has a heightened condition, that will usually increase the base cost and multiply it by the target's level or another value as appropriate. But it will usually be within the description of that particular ritual. And there are rituals such as Create Undead that use costs based on the level of the spell. And I'll go ahead and kind of pop that up over here as well so that you can kind of take a look at that. Now let's go ahead and move into another big part of this, and let's go into a little bit more detail about the checks. So after you have spent the time performing the ritual, you must attempt the skill checks listed in the primary checks entry to determine the outcome, as well as the secondary checks will usually be performed before you do the primary check. Primary checks usually have a very hard DC, and you can go ahead and kind of I'll bring up this over here as well, but you can see the adjustments very hard is usually a +5 to the DC, but it can be more or it can be less. And just to kind of reiterate this again, fortune and misfortune effects don't really work when you're working with the actual checks themselves. And bonuses or penalties from spells that aren't active throughout the entire process do not work. So, for example, you couldn't necessarily give someone guidance and expect that to last through a 3-day ritual. Now, the GM can adjust the DC, kind of like they always can. But let's give a couple examples of what that might be. So the GM can choose to waive the secondary checks. For example, let's say you were doing a divine ritual against a religion check and you happen to be doing it at the high temple of this particular god, and they were a whole bunch of priests for that particular deity that were around you the whole time trying to help you out to do it. They might just waive that secondary check for the secondary casters. Or being in the temple might kind of take away that very hard to the primary check. Or if you're casting a nature ritual, if you are at the foot of a waterfall, under a full moon, in a fairy circle, might reduce the DC of the primary check that you are trying to do. Once again, it is up to the GM's discretion. Now, for the secondary checks are generally going to represent other aspects of casting that are helping the primary caster, usually with a standard DC for a level twice the ritual spell level. And we'll kind of go ahead and put that chart up over here. Now, a different secondary caster must attempt each secondary check. So if it required 2 secondary casters and you had 1 secondary caster that was great in both nature and religion, they couldn't roll both of them. The other secondary caster that you have must be the one who rolls whatever the second check is going to be. Secondary casters do attempt their check before the primary caster, and no matter the results, the ritual proceeds to the primary check. Just because they got bad rolls doesn't mean that the ritual stops and you do not incur the cost. All that the secondary casters can do is give you bonuses, circumstance bonuses, or negatives in order for you to proceed to the primary check. Now, on a critical success, you gain a +2 circumstance bonus to the primary check. On a success, there is no bonus or penalty. You just kind of did your thing, but you didn't necessarily aid. On a failure, you are basically doing a -4 circumstance penalty to the primary check. And on a critical failure, as mentioned before, a critical failure, you not only do the -4 circumstance penalty, but you automatically reduce the level of success of the primary check. Now let's cover one more thing before we move on to an example of how a ritual would go and the steps you would need to go through in order to perform that ritual. But the one thing I want to talk about is if you are performing a ritual against an unwilling creature. Now, there are some rituals that you do, such as Call Spirit, that will require a will save against an unwilling creature. So in order to determine the DC that that particular unwilling creature needs to roll against, it is basically your spell's DC for the ritual Or if you are not a magic user, because once again, a barbarian could be the primary caster for this particular ritual, it will be 12 plus your level plus your highest mental ability modifier, which would be things like wisdom and intelligence or charisma, in order to be a substitute for that spell DC. Now, with kind of all these things put out there, let's go ahead and kind of run through a example ritual. Now, let's kind of take an example ritual. I'm going to use plant growth. So the first thing you are going to need to do is you are going to need, if you are going to be casting the ritual, you need to learn the ritual. All rituals are at the very least of an uncommon rarity, and rituals pretty typically can't be purchased. You basically can't go to the market and buy the ritual in order to learn it. Rituals are often provided as an adventure reward for something that you have done, either going to be the text. Maybe you did a research subsystem in order to figure out what the ritual is, or it could be taught by an NPC who you helped during a particular adventure. The next thing you need to do is you need to make sure that you have the correct casters and pick the best people for the job. All rituals, all of them require at least a primary caster, and there will be a specified number of secondary casters that must be dedicated to this as well. And by dedicated to this is they must be available for the entire length of the particular ritual. Although, as we mentioned, during multi-day rituals, usually, one caster may meditate or chant or do whatever is needed in order to prolong while other people are resting. For plant growth, you basically need one secondary caster, and that secondary caster is going to be rolling against farming lore, or they will be rolling against their survival skill. They can choose if it says or. If there is just a comma between them, and let's say it's 3 casters, then each one of those secondary casters would need to roll one of those particular skill checks. Now that we have our secondary casters kind of sorted out, you, the primary caster, must know the ritual, and you must know the required primary skill check at whatever proficiency level the stat block says you must be. Now, for plant growth, the primary check is going to be nature, and the primary caster needs to be at least expert level. It is at this point, if you are using a spell that has a heightened condition available to it, that you decide if you are going to heighten before you start the casting. Now, heightening does increase the same benefits as heightening a spell. However, it also increases the difficulty to succeed, because you would have to look that up on the new DC chart. The next thing that happens is that you begin the cast, and the cast time passes. Now, the cast time must occur without interruption. Once again, 1 day is equal to 8 hours, and casters usually work in shifts when the cast time is longer than 1 day. So after the cast time has passed, then you begin the secondary checks. Each secondary caster, in this particular case, there's one, and they will either be rolling farming lore or survival, may attempt their secondary check. If there were multiple secondary casters and multiple secondary checks, then each one of those secondary casters would have to roll on a separate secondary check. The DC for secondary checks is going to be the standard for level that's twice the ritual's level. So remember, for the primary check, it's usually done at a very hard or a +5. For a secondary caster, it's just done at the straight level. And once again, just because you fail at a secondary check doesn't mean the ritual is over. That just means that you may have given a positive circumstance bonus or a negative circumstance bonus. However, you have to remember that bonuses of the same type do not stack. So if you had 2 secondary casters and they both luckily rolled a critical success, you wouldn't get +2 and +2 for a +4. You would only get the +2. So let's go ahead and quickly cover those again real quick. For a critical success, you get a +2 circumstance bonus to the primary check. On a success, there's no bonus or penalty. On a failure, you would get a -4 circumstance bonus to the primary check. And on a critical failure, you not only get that -4 circumstance bonus, but you also reduce the degree of success of the primary check by 1 level. So a critical success becomes a success becomes a failure, and a failure becomes a critical failure. Now, between the secondary checks and the primary check is where the costs are paid. So whatever the cost was and whatever resources that were needed in order to perform this ritual, they are consumed at this point directly before the primary check. And until the primary check happens, none of these are lost. Simply put, if you are interrupted at any time before this primary check, then you retain the resources that were needed in order to perform the ritual. And then the primary check happens. The primary caster rolls the primary check. The DC is going to be very hard, or a +5 to the DC for a level that is twice that of the ritual's level. Again, the GM might be able to modify it based on what conditions you are casting that particular ritual in and what planning you might have done that goes into your particular ritual. You would then add whatever circumstance bonuses that came out of the secondary checks, and the check's result is going to be provided in the ritual's description. For example, for plant growth, a critical success will double the crop yield in the area or increase that area to a 1 mile radius. On a success, you will increase the crop yield in the area, and the area is a 1/2 mile circle surrounded by where you are in the center, but it'll increase that crop yield by 1/3. On a failure, there was no effect. And on a critical failure, the flora in the area actually changes in an unanticipated way, and that is pretty much going to be up to the GM to determine. Maybe all of the crops are no longer edible. Maybe you turn the cornfields into an orchid field and they are no longer usable, but this will be determined by the GM. Once the primary check and all of these circumstance bonuses and penalties are added, once again, remembering that circumstance bonuses do not stack. So if you got 2 +2s, you only get a +2. If you got 2 -4s, you only get 1 -4 if there were 2 secondary casters. But if you got 1 critical failure and if you got 1 critical success, those would offset each other to be a -2 as opposed to a -4. So there is some benefit to the bonuses or failures not stacking. Now, I hope this video on rituals kind of helped you out a little bit. Rituals are a little bit complicated, not too much, but you just have to read the stat block really well, know what you're getting into, know that you have the material components that you need, know that you have the secondary casters you may or may not need depending on the level of ritual that you're doing, and you need the time in order to do it. So it is pretty much going to be a downtime activity. Once again, you can try it in exploration mode, but any interruption is going to require you to restart. Now, I hope you did enjoy this video. If you did, feel free to like, subscribe, or hit that notification bell for any other videos that I have coming out there. But whatever you do, I hope you have a great day and happy adventuring. Thanks.